Going to give everybody another moment or two to get signed in, get logged in. We know in the virtual world, people can often run a minute or two late, but while we're waiting for people, if you could please put in the chat, just do a little bit of an introduction of yourself, name, where are you at, and job title. We'll start there. Terry, Kevin, and I will be doing our own introductions in just a moment. But then also start to think about, name a decision in your own life that has drastically altered your life trajectory, and think about how your life would have been different had you selected a different option. So we're going to start with the easy stuff. Name, location, and kind of what you do. But then start thinking in a moment, we're going to have you think about that life decision that you had made. And we see the room continuing to fill up a little bit. Thank you, Mark, for jumping right there in the chat. Mark, I just had a friend taking a trip. They went to Florence, Italy. However, I've never been to Florence, Colorado. I'm assuming it is not the same. Is that a safe assumption for me to make? Thank you. I haven't got the thumbs up of verification. Although I was in your neck of the woods, last week, I met with Kevin and Terri, and I just finished. I was in Denver for a couple of days. And we've got Nandini, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Yeah, if you guys all want to start once you get that intro, we have, Mark says it's down the road from a Supermax prison. I did not drive past any Supermax prisons, Mark, so I don't know how close I was to you. But that may have been a decision that Mark made to live next to a Supermax prison. So as you're dropping in the information, people are still kind of filling in. We want to give them that little bit of time and space. But your name, where you're at, what you do, and then let's start populating the chat here. Name a decision in your own life that drastically altered your life. Think about how your life would have been different had you selected a different option.
And while we're just looking and talking about things that drastically altered your life, Nandini, I'm so interested in your decision to homeschool your children. So I hope that turned out to be a good decision that you made to keep them at home with you. That's pretty cool.
Well, it's an ongoing experiment.
But experiments are good. You learn things from experiments.
Yes.
Jenna's big decision, she moved to New York City in my mid-20s. Would not have grown as much if she hadn't moved.
Definitely scary.
All right, so as we start getting into these introductions, don't lose sight of that decision. Even if you haven't put it in the chat yet, that's okay. We're not going to force participation. But let's go ahead. We're going to introduce ourselves. My name is Joe Schmidt. I serve multiple hats, and one of those capacities is on the Education Advisory Committee here at the Alliance for Decision Education. Kind of my full-time job, I am the Senior Director of Teacher Programs for the Bill of Rights Institute, where I manage the team. We do hundreds of trainings every year. So when Kevin and Alliance for Decision Education said, hey, do you want to do a training? I'm like, yeah, that's what I do all the time. Super excited about it. And I'm also here as Vice President of NCSS, National Council for the Social Studies. We're the largest social studies professional organization for social studies educators in the country. Once I'm done doing my little introductions, I'm gonna drop some links into the chat for you to use if you want to learn more about NCSS. I am hosting our virtual summer conference in a couple weeks. Registration is still open for that. I'll put the chat. This year for 2 days, we are talking about civil discourse. In part because in 2022, I wrote a book called Civil Discourse Classroom Conversations for Stronger Community. But I was a classroom teacher for 9 years. I left the classroom. That's probably my decision. I probably would have been happy forever in the classroom. I was coaching, I was doing student council, I was doing, I guess, all the things that social studies teachers do. But I left the classroom to become Madison, Wisconsin's first social studies curriculum coordinator. I was the state specialist for the state of Maine. I've taught elementary methods. I don't have hobbies outside of social studies, is what I like to tell people. So I've worked with groups like iCivics, Learning for Justice, Colonial Williamsburg, Alliance for Decision Education, Think for Analytics. I'm chairing the See Through Your Vision framework. I just recently was put on a list for doing international talks at U.S. Embassies and consulates around the world, and that type of stuff. When it fits in the discussion. Oh, Mark, I'd love to hear more about that. We don't have anything necessarily today about civil discourse, but I will put in a link so you can see what we're doing in a couple weeks for NCSS. So that's a little bit about myself. I started in the classroom. I made the decision to leave the classroom. Then I made the decision to leave a district. And then I made the decision to leave the state of Maine, where I'm currently working with the Bill of Rights Institute. And I'm here today with a couple fantastic, incredible educators themselves, including Terri. I'm going to turn it over to Terri.
Thanks, Joe. So, hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to our Lunch and Learn series today. So, my name is Terri Davis, and I am a social science teacher at Homewood-Flossmoor High School. I typically teach like upper level students, so juniors, seniors, love it, would never want to turn back to teach anything like lower than sophomores just because of like maturity levels. So, I currently teach US history, sociology, AP, as well as IB psychology. I'm the girls' tennis and wrestling coach, which is an interesting decision that I made because I knew nothing about wrestling except for WWE. So just learning about that process and just being able to connect with students on a different level definitely was a good decision that I made. So I'm currently a senior fellow with the Alliance for Decision Education, and I have presented before with the College Board. I'll tell you this, though. The reason why I enjoy being part of the senior fellowship program with Alliance for Decision Education is because the program itself just helps students to become critical thinkers. And I think that that's so important in our day of age, that we help students to be able to understand that they have to sometimes think about what they're thinking about, right? So we are able to use Decision for Alliance education standards as well as their lesson plans, which are almost scaffolded for students as well as teachers alike, to be able to teach students how to produce like those metacognitive skills, which every educator would love for their student to be able to accomplish, right? So I'll tell you my background in regard to Decision for Alliance Education, or Alliance for Decision Education. I thought about it. I said, oh, I teach psychology. Like these are like vocabulary terms that my students are familiar with in psych classes, whether it's systems 1 or systems 2 thinking or heuristics or sunk cost fallacies. But I really wanted to challenge myself in this particular alliance. So I chose to work with US history students. And I worked with our lower level students. So these were mostly special education learners. They had low attendance rates. Their engagement was horrible. So once we started to go through the lessons, the engagement increased. And I mean, increased to the point where I was looking at students in the back of the class and I'm like, hey, you all get off your Chromebooks. Like, I got to get through this lesson today. They're like, hold on a second. You said something about Abraham Lincoln and why he chose not to free all the slaves through the proclamation. So we were just kind of looking it up and trying to figure out, like, what was his thought process? Like, why would he do that? And it was like this light bulb went off for me. And I was like, this is the best thing ever. And so I also think the other reason why this program is so unique is because it's already what educators are doing in the classroom, right? And so, of course, when administrators come along and they want us to do different initiatives and they want us to do new things, most of the time educators are thinking to themselves, well, where am I going to find the time to do all this? And I will say this: Decision education, it is a platform to be able to use to learn how to explicitly teach good decision-making skills to your students. So that's why I enjoy the program so much, and I hope you guys learn a lot about the program today.
We're going to get you kind of thinking through that decision making, those skill sets. We go back to, okay, we'd ask you, what's that decision you had made? And we're a small enough group. We're at 23. And again, we're not going to force participation, but I think we're small enough that if you want to unmute and share. So, thinking about that decision you made, what were the processes or strategies that you used when making that life altering decision that we talked about earlier? So, if you had already put that in the chat and you want to tell more about that, great. If you hadn't put that in the chat and you still want to tell us more about that, that's great as well. So, we're going to open up the floor for a couple minutes. What were the processes or strategies you used in real life to make your decisions? And if you don't want to unmute, go ahead and use the chat as well.
Okay, I'll just share my experience. When I was in graduate school, I was an electrical engineer, and which was at that time mainly power engineering, and I hated power engineering. So I went to my professor. I said, you know, this is not. I know there's something I don't want to do in my life, which is to be a power engineer. So I said, you know, give me some advice. And he said, you know, there are two areas in the future. One is nuclear engineering, and the other one is biomedical engineering. He said, and we had to do a project, and you know, before we graduate in college. I said, I can't build a nuclear bomb in the school, in the college. So this is too big a project. We don't have an accelerator. So he said, why don't you do a project on biomedical engineering? And I did. So the bottom line is that's the career I chose. So the lesson I learned was I had a mentor who listened to me. He gave me some very solid advice. I trusted him and he trusted me. And that's what helped me make a decision.
Thank you for sharing. I see Mark has his hand raised, and Eric, I saw you went to unmute a second ago. So I'll let you two jump in, and then if there are messages in the chat as well. So people want to read those. Let's go Mark, then Eric.
Yeah. So I talked about moving from California to North Carolina and talked about where I ended up, but I didn't know much about decision making or thought about it, but at least I thought about my regular job, like what would it take me to stay in this job? And that was, would I have opportunities to travel and work on a project in South America? And then going, it was actually to see if a relationship would work out. So I was balancing those, and my boss told me, no, we need you here to just work on logistics and so on. So anyway, that moved me to something that had a lot more consequences later in my life. But I also didn't think to, you know, ask other people, and from taking all the decision stuff we've worked on with the Alliance, could have done a lot better on those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Eric, and then Tim.
Sure. So I'm one of the co-founders of the Alliance, and I guess years ago, I kind of went into semi-retirement. I wasn't sure how I wanted to spend my time, but I thought that it was very likely that I would really enjoy doing something like what we're all doing today. And but I've been overconfident before. And so I'd say probably the most important strategy that I used was to try and check my confidence, my potentially my overconfidence by doing this on a very small scale. And so starting to spend some of my time so that if I changed my mind, the cost wasn't going to be so high and it wasn't going to affect a bunch of other people. And so by doing that, I was able to get this additional information and tighten my confidence intervals up that this was a really good path for me. And that's probably the most important thing that that helped me realize that this is what I want to do.
Thank you, Eric. We're gonna have Tim go, and then we're gonna learn a little bit more from Kevin. But before Tim goes, I want people to start thinking: is there decision making things that you've learned from other people? Right, like right now, we're hearing how other people made decisions, and we're hearing a variety of different ways. So think about in the chat: is there a lesson you've learned about decision making from watching somebody else? But before we get to that part, Tim, tell us about your processes or strategies.
Okay, I'm a retired dentist, just retired at the end of last year. I'm 69 years old. We have a small school district here in northern Illinois, just on the Wisconsin-Illinois border. We've got about, I don't know, maybe 1,000, not even 1,000 kids in the school district. The town itself is 9,000, but we're in a rural community. As a dentist, you talk to people one-on-one. And you're right there. And if you've ever been to the dentist, you know that we always like to ask you, well, we don't ask questions. We don't really care about your answers. We just like to talk to people. And part of doing dentistry is getting people involved in the decision process, because you kind of get an idea which way you want to take their healthcare, or where they could go with their healthcare, but they've got to make the decision themselves. So you got to get them to get on board. We work with a lot of kids, and we're cool about having the parents come into the room. In fact, it's kind of nice if the parents are in the room, because you could talk to the kids, the parents, let them know what you're doing. You build up that relationship of trust. And being a dentist, I take a lot of continuing ed. And when I started to do that, I started to take other classes outside my sphere of influence. University of Chicago has classes on classical studies. I've done that for 22 years. So you start to build on your knowledge, and you can share it on a personal basis with people and make decisions, constantly learning how kids think nowadays. Because I've been doing this for 42 years, and they think differently today than they did 42 years ago. And if you can get the parents on board, now you've got almost a three-way area that you can work with. And I became part of our education foundation back in 97. So we've been doing this for 28 years. Our biggest thing is trying to get those decisions that we can make from the parents, the kids, sometimes the teachers, into the administration, because everything has to be done on a public level through the administration. So you're working with three components, all people, but all people from different areas. And the decision process has to completely be evolving to include new district leaders, new people in the community, new children as they come through the system. So things are constantly changing, even though the theme is the same. And that's why I don't think I would have ever chosen a different profession, because everything just clicked together. And this course on decision making is a no-brainer, because kids have to make the right decisions in life.
Well,
So
great.
that's it.
Thank you for that, Tim. Yeah, we're going to hear a little bit more about that. We're going to see some examples about learning about and teaching about history in the chat. Again, if you want to put any lessons you've learned from other people, go ahead and do that. But Kevin, take it away.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much to everybody who's been sharing. And it sounds like there's already folks who have been thinking about decision making for a while and have experience with the Alliance, which is great. I also know that we've got some new friends on the call and those who may be listening to the recording as well. So welcome, welcome, welcome. In case you aren't familiar, the Alliance for Decision Education, which we refer to as the Alliance, is a national nonprofit and field builder with the mission of improving lives by empowering students with essential skills and dispositions for making better decisions. Founded in 2014 and backed by experts in decision sciences and a broad range of other fields, including several Nobel laureates, the Alliance believes that better decisions leads to better lives and a better society. As a field builder, the Alliance aligns, coordinates, and amplifies the efforts of organizations and individuals working together towards the vision of decision education being a part of every student's learning experience. We partner with teachers, researchers, academic and business leaders, families, and community members to raise awareness and develop solutions that can be scaled in classrooms around the country. So we're very excited that you're here. I'll share quickly before we talk about some specific historical examples. I was a history teacher myself. And when I first joined the classroom, I remember being told to incorporate literacy into my social studies curriculum. And I was conflicted about that because, of course, I love literacy and I love, a holistic education and all sorts of things. But I became a history teacher because I loved history, and so I really wanted to focus on that core content area. And I thought that when people were telling me to infuse literacy into the social studies classroom, I thought that what they were telling me was to do a favor to the English teachers. So I thought they were saying, take time out of your social studies, and instead of teaching social studies, teach reading and writing instead. And I thought the only reason for that was to help students in their reading and writing. What I learned, however, is that the more that I incorporated reading and writing into my classroom, not only did students become better readers and writers, they actually learned more about the history itself. And the as they wrote about historical experiences and as they read more, then that actually fueled their knowledge about the social studies. So it wasn't a completely selfless act for me to incorporate literacy into the social studies classroom. It actually enhanced the social studies curriculum. And while we don't quite yet have the research to back this, I think it's reasonable to assume that the same can be true for decision education. So what we might suggest is that in addition to merely teaching students the facts of a historical event, if you can begin to teach them how the historic events, the decisions that went behind them, and how they can apply those to make stronger decisions in their own lives, then not only will you be doing a favor to students who will learn how to make stronger decisions, but I suspect that their knowledge of those historical events will actually be enhanced as well. So you're getting a 2-for-1 when you infuse decision education into your history lessons. And today we're going to give just a few examples of what this could look like, not to illustrate that these are the only ways to do it, but just to give a sample of how you can both teach the content of history and decision making simultaneously.
So in a typical classroom, it's probably like March, around spring break sometime. And so in US history, we know that we're trying to get to the end of the school year, or hopefully at least to like the civil rights movement, right? So we always teach a lesson about the atomic bomb, right? After we've covered World War II or after we've finished like different theaters. So typically in a history class, like you would start out with some sort of lecture, some sort of lesson plan or activity that would include this sort of information. So the atomic bomb was developed during World War II as part of the US effort to end the war. 2 atomic bombs were dropped by the US, first on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and then on Nagasaki a few days later. Tens of thousands were killed instantly in each city, with massive destruction of infrastructure and radiation sickness, providing adverse long-term health consequences for survivors.
So as Terri said, that's how that's typically taught in a classroom. We give them the facts, we kind of give them this is what has happened, and then we move on to the next topic. But in this case, we actually have a lot to learn about how that decision was made. And the Alliance for Decision Education offers a set of K-12 standards. And one portion of those standards are devoted to what we call structuring decisions. And there's clear overlap between those structuring decisions standards and historical standards. So structuring decisions is all about you know, we make multiple decisions every single day. Some are simple and complex. Some we make as individuals or as part of a group. And focusing on the processes and skills for making quality decisions can improve our ability to reach decisions that work best for us in both the short and long term. So we can study how the US was attempting to force Japan's unconditional surrender. We wanted to avoid costly land invasions, which was known as Operation Downfall. That was the other alternative we were considering to the atomic bomb, which was projected to result in hundreds of thousands of casualties. And also, we were attempting to demonstrate power, especially to the Soviet Union in early stages of the Cold War. On the other hand, there were critics who obviously questioned the moral and ethical debate about targeting civilians. There were questions about whether Japan was close to surrender already, and discussions about whether alternatives were viable, such as could we have demonstrated the bomb instead of actually using the bomb. So some of these same skills that were either part of the discussion or not part of the discussion when the bomb was dropped in the 40s could be applied to students' everyday lives now. Now, most high school students are not responsible for whether or not we're going to drop an atomic bomb on a foreign adversary, but they are making decisions in their own right. And a lot of the undergirding structures that fueled the determination of that decision can be applied in students' lives, such as coming up with other alternatives, clarifying your values and what you hope to be true. Can you test something before going full speed ahead? All of these different things can be applied to students' lessons there. And the more that they're engaging with that, they're not only becoming better decision makers in their everyday lives, but they're also further understanding the history of the atomic bomb itself.
So I pulled together from the Bill of Rights Institute, we have a lesson that helps students not only with understanding decision making, both academic writing. It's focused on a document-based question we call it a DBQ. I'll throw the information here in just a moment in the link if you want to take a moment to read it. We won't have time to do the real super deep dive in here, but the important couple things I want to show is, as I drop the first link, we're starting with a background essay. Right. And we talked and we heard people saying earlier, well, you know, before I made this decision, I talked to somebody. Before I made the decision, somebody in the chat said, right, I looked up all this information. Well, to make a decision, you have to have some information. You need to have some background information. It's hard for students and adults to make decisions about things that they don't know anything about. So we're always wanting to start, if we're teaching US history or teaching any type of history, we want to make sure that students are coming from this base knowledge. And so we've got this little bit of a background essay that you can work with on that. But we don't want that to be the only place, right? That's not a decision. Reading an essay is not a decision. We can read about, and this is what Kevin was kind of alluding to, I mean, we can read about what decisions people have made, and we can read about essays about these type of decisions. But if we really want to get students engaged with this, in what's known as a document-based questions, DBQ, we need students to try to explore some of the good, the bad, the ugly, the perils of the question here. So I've given you this link to a set of documents where students are given the challenge. We say, okay, you've read this background, you understand what's going on here, you understand what's at stake. But now let's take a moment. What are people saying at the time? So these are primary sources. So this is back in 1945. Students are not necessarily role playing or taking this on, but they're saying, okay, well, this person is saying this person is saying this. And we want students to then have to respond to that. A good document-based question is going to have those multiple perspectives, some yeses, some nos, kind of some undecided, some different viewpoints. And then we want students to not only understand how to read those documents, right? That's a skill set. But then how do they make sense of that? And I see Mark, in the chat, right? Many historical events are viewed through our current lens, right? So a primary source, we want kids to think about, yeah, even if it looks easy looking back, well, what were people in this example in 1945? What were they having to wrestle with? What did they know at the time? Because that's where the decision was made in 1945, was based on the information at the time, not the information we have here in 2025. So this primary source set of documents is what helps students kind of think about that lens. Looking back, well, I think it was easy decision to make now. Yeah, but what is the information they had there? And then this is really good with academic writing. So then we're asking students, okay, well, here's your question, right? So the writing prompt is, was the use of the atomic bomb justified? So we need you to think about that decision that was made. Was it the right decision? Was it the wrong decision? And where are you getting this information from? So students are then having to engage in these primary sources, having to engage in this essay, and we want them to be strong writers, right? Academic writing is something it's a skill, and we want students to be stronger writers and better communicators. So in this case, we've got that stance, right? They're going to say yes or no, and then they're learning about these different things. So they might say yes because, but we want them pulling from these primary sources, from this document set. Not just, well, yes, because I think so. Yes, because that doesn't seem right. We want them to try to build an argument the same way we were talking about the process as you guys, right? I asked here, I pulled the information together. And so this is really about students trying to make the strongest case they can make based on the information they have available, and then sorting that information into an answer. So not only is that strengthening their writing skills, but it's also having them deal with kind of pros and cons of multiple perspectives, and then having to clearly articulate a final answer and a final decision in a written format. There's different ways to do this. With small groups or with individuals, you can do this as a spoken, you can do this as a written, but really it's about students being able to think through a process and clearly articulate a stance with evidence, which is kind of that subliminal thing we do over and over when we're making decisions, right? We might not always put pen to paper, but as we're even thinking about, well, where should I go out for dinner tonight, right? In your brain, you're like, well, I know what the menu is here. I know what the prices are here. I know how much money I have in my credit card here. You're pulling those things together to help you make a decision. So that's one example of having students wrestle with a historical question.
Yeah, and that's just one historical situation. There are, of course, more. So as we turn to a separate historic example, Terri is first going to lead us in a little bit of a activity.
Okay, so we want you all to practice some of those metacognitive skills that we'd like to impart to our students. So we're going to read through a race study today. And then after we finish, we're going to ask you to either post, we're going to give everyone a couple of seconds to make their decision, but either post your answer or you can unmute yourself so that we can have a rich, robust discussion around this particular study. So this is the Carter race study, and I want you all to picture that you are part of Carter Racing. So it's a small but promising race team that has had a successful season. The team has had the opportunity to race at Pocono, a high stakes event that secured a $1 million sponsorship deal with Goodstone Tire. However, your team has had engine failures in 7 of 24 races, and this has cost $20,000 per engine. There's disagreement about the causes of the failures. Paul, the head mechanic, thinks low temperatures are the issue. Colder air causes different expansion rates in engine materials. But Tom, the chief engineer, says the data doesn't support that. The relationship between temperature and failure is unclear. The upcoming race forecast, though, is 40 degrees, the coldest of the season. So here's the decision we'd like for you all to make today. Should you race, risking another failure and the potential loss of the Goldstone deal, or withdraw, project your car and team, but forego the chance at a major sponsorship? Okay, so we're going to give you all a couple of seconds to think about that. What would your decision be? Okay, and if you all want to start typing those decisions in the chat, or again, you can unmute yourself and then tell us what your decision would be and why. Okay. So Nandini, you would rather race because the potential payoff is high and failure is not certain. Okay, it looks like you're giving a little bit of rationality to that decision. Race. Oh, Tim is on it. Okay, so I see some decisions are being made because of the excitement of it all. Okay. So
Harriet, there was one up there. Rahul, don't have enough information to make a good decision, was noted up in a response about too. So
oh, okay, that's an excellent point. So you don't have enough information to make a good decision. Okay, Angela, that's a great point, right? So this team was definitely more successful than they failed. And I think that's probably how I would make that decision. Well, there was a greater than 50% chance that these were successful races. And then the other part of the study that we didn't tell you about is that like this team always finished like in the top 8. So they've had a great racing streak. Okay, so Mark says 1/3 engine failure, minus 20,000. And if they don't race, no sponsor. Probably race. Yes, I agree.
hey, I'm curious if people in here, if they've already responded or if they're still on the fence, does that last bit of information that you gave, like they're a consistent top 8 team, does that help people want to be more likely to race, less likely to race, or does that new data not impact you in any way, shape, or form? I think she was saying they normally finish like every race, they're always finishing in the top 8.
Like 8 out of 20.
So they're a pretty good racing team.
It looks like different numbers or numerical solutions, equations are helping people to make their decisions today. That's pretty cool.
Oh, good question.
I think I must have misread. That's a great top 8 out of how many? I thought that was out of how many races, but yeah, because top 8 out of 8 people is still an accurate statement of statistics, but that doesn't necessarily have the same value as top 8 out of 100. So thank you, Angela, for clarifying that.
Mm-hmm. And Tim, the long-term goal of Carter is just to be one of the top racing companies in the United States.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, these are very, very, very good questions. And I'll tell you that this activity is part of a longer activity called the Carter race study, case study, or the Carter race study simulation. And if you Google that, you can pull up the original version. For the purposes of today, we just put it through ChatGPT and said, can you make this shorter so that we could have a quick discussion on it? But if you're curious on the full version, you can find it online pretty easily. And while this seems like a random, disjointed activity, this activity is actually rooted in the Challenger space shuttle tragedy. So, in case you're not familiar, in the mid 80s, NASA was preparing to launch Challenger, which was a space shuttle. It launched, but just over a minute into flight, the tragedy struck. The entire rocket exploded on national television. The crew of 7 astronauts all passed away. It was a horrible scene witnessed on national television, included by many children, and cost billions of dollars. What a lot of folks might not realize is that in the week or so leading up to the Challenger space shuttle, exactly, Mark. The reason that that happened is because there were O-rings on the shuttle that, due to low temperatures, expanded, and that caused rocket fuel to leak out, and that caused the explosion. What a lot of folks may not realize is in the week or so prior to the Challenger launch, a group of engineers at a engineering firm that NASA had contracted with had actually expressed concerns or doubts on the colder temperatures. They expressed those concerns to their management. The senior management at the firm initially supported the engineers and went to NASA. But NASA said, "Are you really sure there's a problem? You know, we got a lot riding on this. Like, you know, do you have concrete proof that this is going to be bad? You know, we really need to make sure that we move forward with this." And so the engineering firm sort of backed off, and the rocket did launch. This connects to the decision education standard that we call valuing and applying rationality. Acting rationally includes adopting goals that are aligned with one's values, holding beliefs that are commensurate with available evidence, making decisions skillfully given one's goals and beliefs, and taking appropriate action. It means pursuing one's life goals using the best means possible. Um, you know, if NASA had gone through a thorough decision-making process and had attempted to be as rational as they possibly could be and still determined that the risks justified the rewards, that would be one thing. But in the case of the Challenger shuttle, they really sort of put their head in the sand, and they were just saying, we really want this to be successful, and we're hoping that this will be successful. And so they sort of moved forward with that based on that hope or that belief, less so on any rational reasons for believing that it would be okay. And so it can be easy for us in retrospect to sort of judge those groups, but the reality is we do that all the time when we make decisions. And fortunately, many of us are not in the position to allocate trillions of dollars or have the lives of people at our based on our decisions. But nonetheless, the decisions that we make in our own realm are important, and we can learn from the way that the decision was made in Challenger, and perhaps put a little bit more rationality into the process. And so as you went through that case study, you know, what we would encourage you, and what we certainly would encourage students, is it's not good if you decided not to race and bad if you decided to race, because we obviously have hindsight and know how Challenger turned out. So it's not about necessarily which option was selected, but consider the thought process that you had in the process. And if you felt like, you know, we need to get more information about this, you know, we need to, there's more things that we need to do, then go ahead and give yourself a little pat on the back, and just know that those are models of how you can make decisions in your everyday lives. If you felt yourself saying, well, we should race because I really want this to be successful, then just consider that, you know, what lessons can we learn from the decision-making process in order to make stronger decisions moving forward.
Thinking about, so we've had a couple pretty high stakes things, right? We talked about dropping the atomic bomb. We talked about Challenger, where, you know, in the end, people's lives were lost. And so you're thinking, okay, well, that might be a little much for my students, but you can think, so related to Challenger, we have kind of a little more low stakes of a decision here. So if Bill races into it, we have a lesson on Reagan's response. President Reagan, the day of the Challenger explosion, was scheduled to give his State of the Union address. Given what had happened, he had to make a decision on whether or not to give that address. So in this scenario, we know how it plays out. And instead of saying, was it, you know, was the dropping of the atomic bomb justified? In this case, well, what was his thought process? Let's analyze what he went through. So if you read up, and let me drop that in the chat. I forgot to put that in the chat if people want to kind of follow along a little bit. we have his speech kind of broken down and annotated. But you can have students say, okay, President Reagan makes the decision instead of giving his State of the Union address, he gives this speech. And if you read through Reagan's speech, you can see the rationale that he's making. It's included in his speech. So if anybody wants to take some of these bullets very quickly, I know we've got just a couple minutes left here before we start to wrap things up. So what decision does he make? Well, he decides to postpone the State of the Union address, and instead he gives this speech. But if anybody's playing along and you've clicked the link and you're reading through his speech, or you remember that speech, does anybody see any of the rationale that he's giving? Does anybody see, like, what is he proposing, right? So I'm having you think about this text, and we're analyzing this decision by looking through what do we think President Reagan was thinking when he made this decision. So does anybody reading through it and want to drop into the chat or on mute and tell us that second bullet or the third one? What does he give for a rationale? And or what does he propose we do next? We can probably take one or two answers before moving on. Anybody want to pull some Reagan? Okay, Jenna in the chat, thank you. She pulls the quote, "Today is a day for mourning and remembering." So that seems like a pretty solid rationale for not giving at least a semi-political talk that evening. I'm sure he probably had that drafted, and he knew some of the things he was gonna talk about. And then he said, "Well, wait a minute. Today is a day for mourning and remembering." And he said, "We don't hide things, right? This happened today. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. We don't hide our space program, even through the failures." Jenna has another quote. "The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future and will continue to follow them." So now he's saying, okay, here's what we need to do next. But I love the examples, Jen and Allison pulling quotes from a text. So something, again, we'd want students to do. President Reagan made a decision. Can we find that rationale and next steps? And if you do that close reading through that, you can see what he's put in there. And then again, we have the same question we kind of asked you at the beginning, kind of to go full circle here. Well, what are those decision-making processes and strategies? Are there any of the strategies you all talked about at the beginning that you used to make a decision that President Reagan used in making his decision? And so even if we don't necessarily get into that now, right, that's a way to make connections with students. If you can say, "Oh, how did you decide where to go eat dinner last night?" Oh, those are actually the same processes and strategies that presidents of the United States make or use when they're making decisions, right? These are transferable skills. They're important skills. They're relevant to students, and we can see them threaded throughout, throughout history as well as a way to learn about history and teach about history. Back to Kevin.
Awesome. So when we gave the examples of the atomic bomb and the Challenger and the follow-up speech, we did not mean to imply that those are the only places that you can talk about decision making within the course of a history classroom. We wanted to give those as just a few examples of how decision education and history can fit hand in hand. And through the course of teaching history, you can begin talking about what were the decisions that were made here and what can we as individuals learn about making decisions in our own lives that we gathered from the way decisions have been made throughout history. In history class, we often teach that things were happened. The bombs were dropped or the Challenger was launched. But we know that in order for that to be the case, the bomb, somebody had to decide to drop a bomb. Somebody had to decide to launch the Challenger. And history is full of examples where people really had a really good, well thought out thought process. And it's filled with examples where people did not have really good, well thought out thought processes. And as students, we can learn from all of those things. And hopefully in that process, again, students will learn more about both decision making and history. They go hand in hand. Their knowledge of the historical events will be further enhanced by understanding who was it that made the decision and what is sort of the backstory that sort of went into it.
And so, because we believe that this is such a powerful tool to help students be able to recognize, like, that these are real people in history that are making real decisions like we do each and every single day. We kind of want you all to think about, like, what other historical events or concepts could you imagine teaching through a decision making lens? And so, we're going to start a word cloud for you all. And so, if you have your phones handy, then, oh, wait. Uh-oh. Hold, please. Technical difficulties. Okay, we'll open it up for questions and discussions right now, and then let me get the word cloud activity posted. So do you all have any questions or any comments so far?
I guess I
Yeah,
would
Mark, go
say
ahead.
that looking at history through a decision-making lens, if you, like give, what's leading up to a battle policy or something, it would make it a lot more exciting than just going through and remembering the facts and what happened. And you can work through, I mean, so much of history is dealing with biases and stuff like that. So there's a lot of way to cover that too.
Yeah, I think that excitement comes from it becoming more personal, right? Because you realize that these things didn't just happen. There were individuals who helped make those decisions, and you kind of get like the real stories behind them. And so I do think that a lot of students connect to that in really exciting ways, because it feels more personal. Yeah, thank you, Mark.
The another just comment I wanted to make is we talk about decision making without putting enough emphasis on goals. The two are, they go hand in hand. You cannot talk about decisions without going into the head of the person, whether it's Reagan or somebody. What were his goals? What did he want to do? Or what are the goals of NASA? So I just have a comment that I don't think we are talking enough about goals. And without appreciating goals, you cannot talk about decisions a lot.
100%. And that is completely aligned to the way that we see it at the Alliance for Decision Education. We talk a lot about values and what are your values in this situation, which sometimes can be tricky in a group setting, right? Because maybe Congress has different values than the president, or maybe like maybe others, if there's multiple different values, but still there should be some attention paid to what are your values and what are your goals, and then do your, because we also see that even in our personal lives. I might value my health, but I might find myself buying Snickers bars every single day instead of the apple, and so do you have a clear values or goal driven process, and then once you have those things, do your actions align with those values and align with the goals? And that takes a skill set. It takes a certain set of discipline, or a way of thinking about the situation, or skills to be able to handle that. And sometimes our historical examples have gotten it really wrong, and sometimes it's gotten it really right. And either way, we can learn from that in our own lives. Thanks for bringing us back to that.
I'm looking at the chat right now and just wanted to address some questions in the chat. So I think that looking at Allison's comment, we can use these particular skills and connect them directly to the lives of students, because these are things that we want them to do, like once they leave like our four walls, right? So we want them to have these transferable skills. So I try to make it a little bit more explicit, because I think that sometimes in education, like, the teacher is like the purveyor of knowledge and we're supposed to hold on to it all and we're not supposed to let our students know like where we're headed, what we're going to do today, and then what this looks like further on down the road. And so I do make it pretty explicit when I am teaching students, and they seem to enjoy it a lot, which kind of ties into Jenna's question. If I've experienced any resistance from students when I take this approach to teaching history, and at first, it is strange. The students are always like, okay, well, why do we need to know what type of decision maker I am? And I'm like, because it's important to know. And then that way I know how to like sort of form lessons around you and the things that you like to do and like how we can have a great school year together. And then after that, it sort of normally transitions itself into like this beautiful project where students are just working all year long on things that they're interested in. And once they learn like those decision making skills, it's the classroom itself becomes like student led, which I have always been very like apprehensive of, because I'm like, no, I lecture to you, you get the material, you give it back to me to make sure that you got it right. But no, like now I have to literally, you know how they say that there's like teachable moments, like it truly does turn into a classroom where there are teachable moments. So it's definitely enjoyable to have students learning history through a decision making lens.
Yo, real quick, I'm going to hang out for as long as folks have questions or want to talk about this, but I am mindful that we're getting close to the hour. So I'm going to wrap up for just those that need to hop. But again, if you've got questions, we are not rushing you and we are happy to hang after. But I just want to thank you so much for attending this webinar today. I hope it has been insightful. And, you know, what I'll say is, you know, we are very interested in helping students make decisions. That I think is something that is beneficial for them both now and in their future. And what we'll say is schools are exploring many different ways to make this happen. Some are teaching it really explicitly, like they might be a decision-making course, or they learn about it in their advisory period, or etc. But some may not be able to do that, and so they are infusing decision education into their content areas. And so we gave one example of that today, which was teaching it through a history class. And hopefully we gave a few illustrations of how, while you're teaching history or all the things that are in your standards or that your school or your state or whoever is expecting you to learn, that we are also covering other things as well. But this can also be done in the science classroom, the English classroom, the math classroom, the physical education classroom, the coding and computer science classroom, and many others. We hope that you'll connect with us at the Alliance, and following this call, you will get a survey. We are going to ask you, please to fill out that survey and just be competent work for this call and what you think that we could do, what we'd like to see in the future. And then we'll also include in that same email an opportunity to sign up for our newsletter. If you are not yet signed up for the Alliance for Decision Education e-newsletter, please consider to do so. We have many opportunities for you, and we want to be able to share those things with you. So again, I'll stay after for those who want to continue to talk about this, but for those that need to hop, I completely understand. Thanks for doing that. Thanks for joining us today. We've got more webinars this summer. 1 week from today, we'll be helping students pick the college that's right for them. That's going to be an excellent panel discussion that we've got. So I hope you'll continue to come to those, sign up for our e-newsletter, and please do fill out the survey. All right. Terri and Joe, I wasn't sure if there was anything that y'all wanted to share. Otherwise, it looks like Mark, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Oh, I guess I was just thinking that, you know, what information we get to history. I mean, when I started back in grade school or junior high, you know, it was all white men that wrote history and stuff. And then National Geographic had a whole exhibit on what was happening in the rest of the world or with women. And then you think, oh, well, that's the lesser stuff or so on. And then looking at it just gives you a whole different perspective. So a lot of it is looking at the information that you're maybe not seeing. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and there's so much great writing done on that topic. And I guess what I'll say is one, it brings a very important insight into the decision that we as adults make, right? And each school system is set up. So some teachers have the autonomy to decide what's being taught. In other cases, it might be a district curriculum advisor or somebody, but somebody is making choices as to what history is being taught. So just like our students need access to good, effective decision-making skills, the adults in the system, we need that as well. Because as Rahul mentioned, keeping things in mind, like what are your values, what are your goals, and picking curriculum that sort of aligns with that goal, I think is really, really important. So the choice of what topics you cover, I think shows the importance of us as decision makers. And then what I'll say is whoever sets that, once it's set, you can always look at history through a decision-making lens. Now, once you know who is the decision maker, I think that's an important consideration to keep in mind. But every person in the history of humanity has made decisions. And so no matter what topic you're covering, I think there's opportunities to sort of infuse decision making, the good or the bad.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I think too, when we're looking at decisions that individuals make, we do have to look at the bad. And sometimes we don't want to talk about that necessarily in US history. But I think the fact that there are so many different perspectives that we can look at now, I think that's probably another important metacognitive piece for students to like sort of be able to create those critical thinking skills when we look at like, okay, well, this decision was made, but how did it impact? Or maybe how did other individuals feel who maybe did not necessarily have the voice at the time to express their decisions or opinions about whatever that particular content was. So I think, it's pretty awesome. And I think that's the beauty of history too, is that we continue to learn different things about our content so that we can bring it into the classroom.
Thank you. Okay, according to my Zoom, it looks like Rahul was next and then Tim.
No, Tim, you go ahead because my question is a little bit, maybe slightly on the tangent. So go
Oh,
ahead.
okay. Yeah, I just had some basic housekeeping things. First of all, are replays of this webinar available?
Yes, we are going to share the recording later this summer.
Okay, and slides, obviously.
Sure, yes. Yeah.
How about transcripts of the chats?
Oh, that's a good question. We are recording this to the cloud, which I believe does share the transcripts of the chat. And so, Tim, when we share the recordings out forthcoming, would you just email me back and ask for the transcript of the chat and I'll be happy to provide that.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, if there's no other hands up, this is slightly a little bit on the tangent, and you may be covering this in one of your other sessions, but I teach health to students. I run a nonprofit which teaches health to middle school students. The question I had was when I'd want to motivate young children, let's say grade 6, 7, 8, to adopt healthy lifestyles, I try to link it to their long-term goals. Whether they want to be, whatever they want to be, a sports player or, they want to be a physician, a lawyer, whatever. And so the first exercise I always do is think about what you want to be. And again, in 6th grade, they may want to be something. In the 7th grade, it may change to something else. But that's okay. But anytime, I at least want them to think. So here's my question. Is this an appropriate strategy to motivate children at such a young age? Because they haven't thought about, many kids, even at high school, don't know what the hell they're going to do once they get out of high school. So I'm a little unclear about it. At what age is it appropriate to link their long-term goals, to motivate them to be healthy? And maybe it could even be short-term goals. You want to be in the soccer team, or hey, you better be physically healthy, maybe not otherwise. So just any comments on that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. I have thoughts, and this could easily fill easily a 1 hour webinar. There's very fascinating research on what we call temporal discounting, which is the tendency to trade off our long-term benefits for short-term gratification. And there's a whole bunch of strategies for, I mean, I even saw things like the more time students spend in nature, the better they are at prioritizing their long term. Or the another one, just as one example, is instead of saying, for example, do you want $5 now or do you want $50 a year from now? If you can make a year from now more concrete. So for example, instead of saying, do you want $5 now or $10 a year from now, you can say, do you want $5 now or $10 a year from now when you will be 16 years old? Because that helps them better picture the future. So anyways, there's tons of ways that researchers have begun to address temporal discounting. I will say from a practitioner, because I was a middle school principal for over 5 years, and I worked in very challenging situations and students from like very low income communities. And it was very, very, very difficult for them to picture the future because many of them said, I might not be alive in 30 years. Like I might not, you're asking me to picture the future when like I'm thinking about whatever. And so given that sense, it's very rational for them to, if they're in class, of course they're going to talk with their friend instead of listening to the lecture, because when they're talking to their friend, they get the benefit now. Like they get, they whatever it now. It's if they sit and listen to the lecture, they could have benefits in 10 years, but they're so far away from thinking about 10 years. And so I think the one thing that I'll say is it can't be something that we have one conversation with a student one time, and then all of a sudden they're going to be thinking about their long-term future. We have to be having relentless conversations with students over and over and over and get in the habit of saying, what will this do to benefit you now? And what will this do to benefit you 10, 20 years from now? I'll say two more super quick things about this. And then, like I said, I could talk a lot more. The first is, I think most of us can benefit from sacrificing more now in order to benefit more in the future. We see this with like retirement savings, the way we eat, all of these things. But I will say there are some people who have the exact opposite problem, who they save so much for retirement that they won't even go out and enjoy a dinner, or they're so addicted to exercising that they can't ever just relax on the couch just one night and kind of take it easy. And so I think it's important to, again, when it goes back to values and goals, is I think most of us, it's probably good that we can sacrifice a little bit more in order to benefit from the future, but we wouldn't want to swing that too far into the extreme, because life is worth living right now as well. And so, kind of keeping all of those in priority. Gosh, there's so much more I can say. Habit formation is huge, because then you don't have to like think about it. You can just sort of like automate those processes. There's a lot that can go into it, but yeah, getting that is like the challenge of 2025 is like, how do we get kids to think a little bit more about that future?
Can you please, I'll be quiet now, but can you please hold a separate seminar on this subject? Because if
We
you
should.
you could-
That is a good
yeah,
topic.
as you said, you could spend a whole hour. Thank you.
That's a great question, Raul. And I'm just going to make it quick because I know it's almost like 1:15. But that's something that we always like talk about, right? Like how young is too young to teach children to make a decision, right? And so, even when you look at it from a psychological standpoint and you're talking about, cognitive and motor skills and all of those fine things, like I think like Kevin said, we have to make this an initiative where it's constant, right? And so you don't just talk about it one time. You don't just address it like every week, maybe on a Friday after your weekly quiz. It really has to be constant. And I can say, and wow, there's no research behind this. Like my grandson, for instance, he's almost 2. He'll be 2 in July. And so he has very great vocabulary, especially when it comes to the word no. So, I give him decisions frequently, right? And I'm like, okay, well, if you want to watch Elmo, then you have to do X, Y, or Z, right? And he like stands there and he looks at me and he's like, okay, well, I'm going to do this because I like to watch Elmo. And so I think too, sometimes, as educators, we may not give like children enough credit for how much they do understand and how much they recognize like cognitively. And so again, it's just something that we have to continue to do with like our young people. But I think you can probably start teaching, critical thinking skills and how to make good decisions at a young age, but we just have to continue to do it.
Yeah. One of the best childcare books I had growing up, they talked about, your kids are baby proof for 8 or 9 months, but then no comes in. And then you just give them couple of alternatives that are both okay for you type of thing, but then they're making those decisions. And in a lot of ways, I don't think my parents wanted me to think about making decisions, just follow what they wanted me to do, which, is something that I still think we're dealing with in parenting.
Yeah. Yes, but I think that does bring us back to Rahul's question is I think merely telling them here are the health rules and just follow these health rules and obey us, whatever. They might do that while they're in our view, like while we're hovering over them. But the moment that they're sort of not with us, then they're gonna do other things. And so I think it behooves us, instead of just saying, here's a list of things and follow these things blindly, it behooves us to instill them with decision-making skills. And that's much harder to do, but it's a far greater payoff in the end, because even when we're not standing over their shoulder, or even when whatever, we can trust them to use those skills to make good, effective decisions.
Great. I wanted to just explore one other area. I was also thinking about frameworks and stuff like, oh, okay, what if Pizarro came and met the Incas, and they were amazed by the culture, but then they destroyed it. What if they met as equals or something like that? What would be different about the world? They were both bloodthirsty cultures, but they had a lot of different stuff. And anyway, Peru was a lot cleaner. The Inca was a lot sanitary environment. They could have learned a lot from each other. And just things like that. Or when would governments, where have governments actually taken care of themselves, like Sweden during, good times, saved up so that they could do recessions, and then look at collaborations of governments and things like that. You talked about objectives and frameworks, but you might look at different points in history. If they had been radically different, what would that have changed? I don't know, is sort of a left field area or whatever.
No, it's great. And it is an interesting thought experiment to help get students thinking critically.
Yeah. I guess the last thing, there's a guy named David Sloan Wilson that works on evolution, where collaboration and stuff is almost a stronger force in human evolution. And so he has things on working, rules for how to solve tragedy of the commons and stuff like that. It'd be interesting to look in history where those are satisfied or not. And, building trust in governments and what it does, and where you don't have trust, like in, some Central American or African countries and their wars. I don't know. It would be a different frameworks or objectives for overall objectives for history or so on. Anyway,
Totally.
just a
I'm
thought.
not sure if y'all can hear me or not, but yeah, I think it's so fascinating. And this is where somebody shared earlier, like this feels exciting to learn, like kids are gonna love coming to history class because, it's just so thought-provoking. Like, what if this, or what, how did this play out, or things like that. Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. There's a reference called the 5 essential something of effective thinking. And, so it talks about doing something till you fail, but also, looking where things have come from in the evolution of thought and where it's going, and, working those lessons into history. The history things are what you're doing now, but that sort of says, here's an explicit way to do those things. You're also taking history and, oh, it's going to continue. And we're, at that present point where you have to make those decisions.
Yeah, that's wild for students to think about, that they're
Okay.
part of history. Yep.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all very, very much. I appreciate you making time out of your Monday for us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, especially with all your thought-provoking questions. This was a great day.
All right. Good work. Thank you.
Thank you.